Hey, Brittany.
Hi, Karen. How are you?
I'm good. We're back for another episode of
It's the E word. It's my
Word.
favorite time of the week.
Well, we have something, I guess. What's the word? I was thinking of juicy, but I just don't think it's a juice. I don't think it's juicy. I just think it's just absurd. Another topic
Yeah,
that popped
I
up
was.
in the news.
Yeah, let's not use juicy because the person we're speaking about is quite thirsty, quite parched.
Well, the person we're talking about is Professor, I hate to put that name in front of her name, Professor Amy Wax from the University of Pennsylvania. She's a law professor.
Huh.
And, she made some remarks over the
Okay.
years, and a group of students actually complained about her because some of these remarks were quite flagrantly, racist, misogynistic, all the words that we could think of. This
Okay.
is what happened, and she has finally been sanctioned and suspended because of her remarks, both in the classroom and some outside of the classroom.
Two questions for you.
Hmm.
First, was she a tenured professor?
Yes.
Okay. And so for those listening or who are unaware, tenured professors, uh, tenure means that essentially no holds barred, right? That you are of a space in your career where you are able to work as a professor. Your contract is not up year after year after year. Um, and the disciplinary proceedings for a tenured professor, it's really kind of a, would you say it's kind of like a trust system, right? We trust that you've done your job well enough such that you can escape scrutiny.
Right. It also gives you, I think, just freedom. And in a way, freedom of speech without retribution in many ways, right? Because academics are supposed to challenge, I guess, the status quo, and they need some space to do that in order to enlighten students and think differently. But when that power is, used irresponsibly, it could have some detrimental effects when you are a tenured professor because you can't just be fired just like that. And to that
Yeah,
end,
which
right, like she was suspended and she's getting half for a year and getting half pay for a year. And I think she's also not allowed to collect any additional summer pay. But
hmm,
some of these remarks that she made are just really horrible. And in any other environment, I think, would probably get you fired.
okay. So this leads to my second question, which is I know you alluded to some of these statements, but can you give us a little bit more detail? What has this professor said?
Yeah. So, okay. So, one of the statements she has said is, I don't think I've ever seen a black student graduate in the top quarter of the class, and rarely in the top half of the class. Now, you might think that, if that's a statement of fact, maybe that's a statement of fact. Although she went on to publicize grades by race externally, which is against school policy. But she has also said, uh, in Mexican men are more likely to assault women, and remarking such a stereotype was accurate in the same way as Germans are punctual and that gay couples are not fit to raise children. And I'm quoting from a Daily Beast article.
So she just said, I need to across everyone everyone can
Exactly. Exactly.
receive this. Yikes.
It's well, you know what? She's including all other groups, right? In an earlier interview in 2019, hold on, let me find it really quick because I just lost it. But she said, we are, okay. She she was speaking. She was speaking in an interview after the National Conservatism Conference in Washington D.C., and she was promoting this idea of quote cultural distance nationalism, or the
Mm.
belief that quote we are better off if our country is dominated numerically, demographically, politically, at least in fact, if not formally, by people from the first world, from the West, than by people from countries that had failed to advance. Let us be candid. Europe and the first world, to which the United States belongs, remain mostly white for now, and the third world, although mixed, contains a lot of non white people. Embracing cultural distance nationalism, means, in effect, taking the position that our country will be better off with more whites and fewer non whites.
Interesting. Okay. So many questions here.
Lots of, I just want to, and I also just want to reiterate for the people, she's a law school professor. So I just
Correct.
also feels like there's additional undertones when you have that kind of position.
Correct.
Right.
Because the position of a law school professor, especially at, a highly esteemed law school,
Hmm.
there's a lot of, I would say, capital that comes with that position, right? So our internal biases will allow us to make certain shortcuts. We hear Penn, great. We hear law professor. We think highly qualified, right? Um, and so we hopscotch over certain checkpoints that would allow for us to question what she's saying, the ideas that she's espousing, this idea of cultural distancing, is analogous to social distancing, right? That's what immediately came to my head and makes us think about safety.
Hmm.
Right? Words mean things, and a law professor knows that better than anyone. So this idea of cultural distancing, instead of this melting pot that the United States is known for in the sense of freedom and being welcoming and being this cultural melting pot, we see that maybe it's, you know, maybe a cultural bag salad, but all of the accoutrement that make the salad more interesting. Let that settle at the bottom, and let's have, my particular preference or her particular preference at the top. And so it's not cultural distancing so much as it is a cultural stratification designed to reinforce white nationalism,
Hmm.
racism,
Yep.
and for those who say that, many of us think of racism as kind of this one-to-one interpersonal preference, prejudice, dislike, hatred. But when we're really talking about racism, we're talking about these systemic plays, right? And we see this happening because for her to publish grades by race. Now, my question is, well, is she grading them blindly and then saying, oh, okay, this person, or is she saying, well, Karen is the black girl, so I'm going to look at her exam through a particular lens?
Right.
She's already shown us that she does not believe that somebody who is anything other than her particular preference, right? White, heterosexual, or European of European origin, as the person who is superior. So these are all of these insidious ways that we can create systems to reinforce inequity.
Right. And what is even more insidious is that she's teaching young people these
Correct.
views that, especially at a time when they're formulating their own perspectives,
Right.
and in a profession that, in some ways, depending on which way you go, codifies these beliefs, has the power to codify these beliefs, right, into the American legal system, right?
Hmm.
So it actually has this potentially has this domino effect that in many ways goes unseen if unchecked.
Correct.
And
Because
that,
how many students, right. So I would also like to know how many students complained. Um, and this is a moment where I'm actually feeling this. I'm having like a very visceral physical reaction to this because I went to law school and in a class of 200, there were 12 students who identified as Black American students. And in our sections, in our constitutional law courses that everyone is required to take in your first year, you go through the court cases that discuss affirmative action. And that is your opportunity to have everyone kind of look at you and presuppose that you are not there for anything other than checking a box, filling a quota.
well,
Reg-
she did tell one student that was a double Ivy League leaguer that she only achieved that because of affirmative action.
Okay, so this is that moment, right? This is that fear that so many uh, students of color in law school face because you already know to anticipate the prejudice,
Right.
right? And you already know that you have to defend your place, though you've been admitted like anyone else, though you're sitting in the same classroom. There's a supposition, there's already a bias in favor of the belief that you are undeserving, regardless of the fact of your, your merit-based performance and all of the other things. Most people who get into law school are exceptional people,
Mhm.
period. And so to create an environment that is hostile to them or and to reinforce this again, even though I don't think she was teaching constitutional law, um, it reinforces any particular biases. And like you said, these are young people. So is she truly creating an environment where um, all types of thought is being challenged? Because my question to her is, okay, well, what does advancement look like? What about the other countries that are part of the first world that are not in Europe? Then how do we, what do we do with that?
Well, she sort of has an answer for that too. So
Oh, great.
you kind of brought up, well, she talked about how these third world countries are basically mostly non-white people, are basically aren't smart enough, essentially, to
Mm,
advance the culture. She has a specific call out for Asian Americans. So given her history, we're going to make an assumption that she falls into this whole, model minority myth, right?
hmm hmm
And so she basically said in a podcast in 2021 with Brown University economist Glenn Laurie, she said Asian immigration to the United States is, quote, problematic due to the danger of the dominance of the Asian elite in this country. Basically, she's going on to say, as long as most Asians support Democrats and help to advance their positions, I think the United States is better off with fewer Asians and less Asian immigration.
So this is all artifice to support her political leanings. And
Yeah,
I guess so the question then is, what role does that have in the classroom?
right.
How can we prepare students to understand and recognize the biases that they may be presented with? So you can filter. Again, biases have it's a screening test, right? Much like you have to, so for those of you who are on social media and from a marketing perspective, I would assume when a celebrity is endorsing a particular product using their social media, they have to acknowledge that it's an ad.
Right.
They have to acknowledge so that you as a consumer can understand that this person's been um, compensated, right, to talk about this product in a favorable way. And they allow for you to determine that. Similarly, how can we create a space where her political leanings, students can understand that and contextualize it and go forward and say, okay, is what this professor saying reflecting actual facts, or is this person really kind of presenting me with an argument in favor of one, white nationalism, two, white nationalist conservatism, and probably fascism, right? Like, how can we do that? And then my question to Penn is that what you want to be known for?
Right. Well, I mean, that's a big question, but I'll go. So I'm going to answer one question you asked
Okay.
earlier
I've
about.
asked you a bunch. Thank you so
I
much
know.
for tolerating
No, no, no,
it.
no. I don't have all the answers to them, but just because I have an answer to one of them. I don't know how many students like officially complained in the very beginning, but
Okay.
what Penn did was they hired basically a dean from Northwestern Law School
Hmm.
to run the investigation.
Okay.
26 alumni. They interviewed 26 alumni as part of the complaint. But guess what?
Hmm.
Amy Wax refused to participate in this
Ah,
investigation. So, which I find super interesting because if you stand on your beliefs, right, then you participate in this, and you can say that it was part of
correct.
academic pursuits and challenging students to think differently or whatever the language you want to use, right? But she refused to participate, so we actually don't know what her mindset was. We can just make inferences around that. But one of the things that I like what you said is that you want students to be able to understand where the professor stands, right? So that they can, um, you know, make judgments for themselves based on the content they're being delivered. However, I think the next step on that is like, what is their power in that situation, right? So
Hmm.
if you understand that your professor leans in a particular direction and it's not your direction, is this professor inviting debate, which is what they're supposed to do, is, in my view, not necessarily take sides, particularly in law, right? Particularly in law, and you
Right.
can correct me on that, right? But, not take sides, but invite people to understand what both sides are and then come to their own determination, right? But if you have someone who is acting in this manner and making such controversial and just defamatory statements, is it a safe place for you to stand up and say, hey, I think that's racist and I don't like it? And what
Correct.
is the retribution, if any, that
Correct.
you may get when you do something like that? So I'm also mortified for the students who felt differently, no matter how they identified. Obviously, particularly for the people of color, when for the black people, sorry, when she's making those statements about them, or the Mexican people in her class potentially, when she's
Correct.
making those horrible statements about them. How do you, as a
As a
student,
young Mexican man at an Ivy League institution,
right?
contextualize, right?
And you're there because hopefully you're there because, like you said, it's very hard to get into law school. It's a special set of students that can actually do that. So you've made it this far, and you've probably traversed a lot of barriers to get there, and then you step into this classroom and you hear you're just it just
You're
hits you.
gutted. You're
Yeah.
gutted.
And what
And
do you do with that?
So let's talk about a law school classroom,
Okay.
right? Most classrooms you conduct a process called the Socratic method,
Okay.
which is it is not didactic in the way that a lot of undergraduate classes are, right? The professor comes in, they present you with information, you write down the information, it's up to you to ingest it and perhaps regurgitate it when there's a final, midterm, etc. In law school, first, they're rarely anything other than the final. So you may not have an understanding of the way that you've dealt with the material until the end of the class.
Hmm.
Surprise! But with the Socratic method, the professor comes in, you are typically reading and you're tasked with briefing court opinions, right? What's happened before.
Mm-hmm.
And the professor will usually ask a series of questions. What happened in this case? What were the facts? What's the issue? What are the two parties litigating? And ultimately, what did the court decide? But out of that, the point of asking the students the question is to, as you said, extract discourse, extract critical thought, engaging people with differing opinions with the ultimate goal of creating a safe space for elevated discussion.
Mm-hmm.
There is a critique now that many people will say people are oversensitive, right? And you can't have a discussion anymore. Back in the day, you could say something without offending someone and so on and so forth. And I think there is a space to, again, have critical discussion. I don't think that higher education is a space where everyone has to agree.
Correct.
And I also don't think that higher education is the space for professors in powerful positions or for really anyone to espouse hateful speech, right? Because she knows better than anyone, right? The First Amendment does not protect all speech,
Mm-hmm.
does not protect hate speech, does not protect incitement. So, my question is, let's use the Socratic method. What happens if there is a Mexican American male in the classroom? When she said, Mexican American men are known to offend, they are, they have higher rates of assaulting. She said assaulting people or assaulting women, did she say?
Um, keep going. I'll tell you.
Yeah. So my question is,
It's a
she
very
says that,
long article with a lot of things that she's done.
which is so sad. But what if another student
Assaulting women.
assaulting women,
Mm-hmm.
say another student, woman or man, right, now refuses to engage with that student for fear of their own physical safety, or they attack this Mexican American student because they believe that he is prone to violence.
Right.
That statement that she made in a position of authority is incitement. That is not protected speech.
I agree with you. I
I
agree.
just, I don't, and I'm glad they conducted the investigation. I'm glad that it seems that they were thorough. And then the fact that she refused to participate, to your point, what's the problem?
The
Do
problem.
you not want to be held accountable for the statements that you're making? Is that the problem? Do you
And
not want to take responsibility?
you should be. You're part of the group that you are elevating. And
Correct.
so you should stand proud with that group and defend, or maybe you don't feel like you need to defend, but you're in this inquiry, defend your beliefs. But instead, you chose not to participate for whatever reason.
Or to
And
add context, right? If she said, well, listen, there was this study conducted by the US Justice Department, and what came out of that study is X
right.
versus, personal animus.
This reminds me of, it's not law school. It was actually in middle school.
Hmm.
It wasn't my son, but it was a student. She was in eighth or ninth grade. It was like, anyway. And she was in a class, and the teacher was talking about some literature and decided to use the N word because it was illustrative of the work that they were talking about. And she chose to use that word over and over again in the classroom. In that classroom was just one Black student, female student. And this was her choice. Okay. This was her choice to do so. It was very upsetting for that student. And she left the classroom distraught that her teacher would use this word regardless of the literature, right? And
Correct.
again, use it over and over and over again, right?
Right.
And other students actually came to her and asked her if she was okay, which actually validated how she was feeling and that she was not
Hmm.
alone, even though those students were not were white students actually.
They
They
knew
felt
it was wrong.
they knew it was wrong. She told her mom. The reason why I know is her mom called me for advice or whatever, and I was like, "You need to share that experience that that wasn't the right move to make because
Hmm.
for whatever reason she made this choice." Ultimately, it came out that she didn't think anything was wrong with it because it was in the literature, right? And although, and when it was pointed out that there's other ways, right? You could have made the same point
Correct.
without, you know, creating this animus between you and the student and other students and making her feel uncomfortable. She actually doubled down on her original rationale. And then eventually I think she had to make a switch and apologize to some degree, but I don't know that, I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know if she meant that apology or not, or whatever the case may
Hmm.
be.
Hmm.
But there's a sensitivity that you do need to have. I mean, I also recall, and this is not as uh, deep as that, but I went to school a long, long time ago, right? And history class was particularly difficult for me because I was always maybe one Black person in the room or
Yep.
whatever.
Same.
And talking about slavery and things of that nature in such a cavalier, nonchalant way without regard for how I might feel about that, right, was the norm back then. But as we move towards, modern days, then that starts to change. I also remember with my own son, he was in fourth grade and they were doing a project on the Underground Railroad. And he wasn't really participating. Um, I came to find out in the way that the teacher wanted. And he told me, he was working on an assignment and he told me that he wasn't comfortable asking her any questions because when he did, she shut him down. And so I actually wrote her a very detailed note and said to her, hey, I mean, it's very long, but basically it was
Hmm.
like, hey, I understand that you're not engaging him in the way he needs to be engaged. Keep in mind that you're talking about a very difficult time in our history that is particularly sensitive to a Black person. And the content that you are covering right now basically says that when boys turn 10, they are put in the fields. And my son is 10. So I don't know how you're teaching this class, but I need you to emphasize the bravery and the resilience that comes with our history. And I kind of went into a lot of detail.
Correct.
And she came back and she said, I never thought of it that way,
Hmm.
which was interesting and fascinating, right? Like she never thought about flipping the narrative
Correct.
at all. It was just one of victimization and hostility. And of course, all those things were there. But then she never wanted to talk about or never thought about talking about, sorry, how our people transgressed all of that. And so I'm just giving these personal examples because I think it really harkens back to the sensitivity that educators need to have when talking about sensitive subjects. It's not saying that you shouldn't talk about sensitive subjects. It is just saying that you need to do so with empathy, right? And understanding of the individuals that you are talking about,
Correct.
and create safe spaces for discourse and disagreement, right? But knowing that no one is being singled out or attacked in those moments.
And this is why it is so critical for educational institutions to apportion a part of the budget to upskilling and teaching their educators. In the
Mm-hmm.
example you just gave, it seems that that was not her intent. The impact was such that she created an unsafe environment for your son. She didn't intend to do it, but that's what happened. Had she had the requisite instruction, had she been challenged herself to re-engage with the material that she's probably taught countless times
Countless times.
and spin it on its head, right? Be innovative, be creative, and also know your audience. Think about this using empathy, the other E word, right? Empathy, right? How would you feel if you were one of your students hearing this? Are there other stories that have been told? And for listeners who are thinking, oh, well, that's just how things were back then, you know, my response to that is we would never have any progress if the way things were being done was just the status quo. There have always been abolitionists. There have always been people who have been challenging what was normal,
Right.
the disruptors, if you will, right?
But there's never been accountability for why that was needed, right? That's the
Exactly.
problem. It is still glorified today. Like you watch any period piece, and I love a period piece, don't get me wrong, right?
Mhm.
But when you watch these movies or these episodics and they talk about, the 18th, 16th or 17th century and all the violence that occurred, it is glorified in the name of progress, right? And
Correct.
that progress hurt a lot of different groups, even before we get into some of the things that America's known for, right? That came from a long line of history of violence um, and ravaging and all of those things. And
Mhm.
so when you fail to acknowledge why you need all of these things, why we need to have these conversations, why it has been detrimental for centuries, then it's hard to fix or
Correct.
understand why anything needs to be fixed.
Right. And goes back to the question of what does advancement mean? What does that look like? Why are we
Yeah.
glorifying colonialism over diplomacy?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And not seeing that as an opportunity to, could we have gone about this another way?
Yeah.
What is trade? You know what I mean? Um, and we're starting to see that now, right? We are having to rethink the way that we're engaging with markets. And that's um, these pastoral uh, retellings of the good old days, right? These rolling green hills and these stately mansions and all of that. And no one asked, well, who built that? Who's cutting the lawn?
Yeah.
Jeez, I can barely, right? Um, and and additionally, confronting that with the truth, right? These people
Yeah.
were not um, cash rich, right? Their assets required and relied on the ownership of other human beings. Without that, you had very little.
Thank you. I was having this debate with a friend of mine actually yesterday. We were talking a little bit about reparations, right, which is a
Mm,
hot topic. And um, we were like, okay, let's not talk about if it happened, distribution, because that's a whole rabbit hole.
sure.
But, it was like nailing down the accountability piece, like America just acknowledging that this publicly this happened, and that, you know, America was built on the backs of free labor, mostly from African Americans, Africans, etc. Right? And I was saying to her, can you, because then we kind of went into a little bit of the money part. I was like, can you imagine? And I wish I'm not an economist, but I wish I were in this situation. But here's my idea, right?
If you
If
are listening, drop some resources for us.
drop some resources, do this calculation, which is if you took some of these big companies, like if you took Google from its inception and took away all the salaries, free
Mm.
labor, right? From its inception, where would it be today versus where it is? Well, where would it be versus where it is today by paying salaries, right? Like if you just looked at some of these companies across the board, even the ones from way back then, I know a couple of studies have been done around that. How have they benefited and who has been hurt by that? Then you'll understand the value of free labor. You can just like, look in your own life, and if you get something for free, you don't have to pay for it. You have more money in your pocket. This is exponentially different. People get caught up in the how much and who's it going to go to, but that acknowledgement is really important, that because of these horrific systems, it allowed certain people to advance. Amy Wax, right? Because you're talking about third world countries having advanced. Well, why is that? You raped and pillaged, right? These other countries in order to advance your own, and are still doing so, you know, and refuse to give back.
And I think about fast fashion, right? We see fast fashion companies now
Mm.
where you can buy, I don't know, a, a coat. It's fall now, right? For $20. And you say, this is a great deal.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't see the invisible labor that's exploited.
Exactly.
You don't see the environmental costs that come with fast fashion, right? You don't see the beaches where it, you know, comes up and compromises people's access to things like clean water and, all of these things. And so it's it's not that difficult to understand because we live with it every day. I think the key coming out of this is re-examining power, re-examining what we would just we what we have been taught, you know, the spaces in which we're taught, and the responsibility of those institutions that they have to us, to students, to
Yeah, to
to the
provide
parents who are paying for it.
a
You
ridiculous
know,
amount of money.
correct. You're not paying for your child to be harassed.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, that point right there is just insane. If I think, the thousands upon thousands of dollars in tuition
Hmm.
that each child is paying to some degree, right? Like, and you go into a hostile environment? No, and that's why you also see this trend of students, or, young people rejecting college for a lot of different reasons. But this
Correct.
doesn't help the whole entire situation. I mean, it's University of Penn, for example, so it has a long-standing reputation and brand, and so, more than likely will power through. But these smaller institutions need to be very wary of who's on staff and what their response is and how they're going to approach academic freedom for professors and students, right?
Hmm.
It's a huge responsibility to educate the next generation. And you have to be really careful, particularly in this environment, because
Yeah,
more than an investigation will happen. Somebody will understand their true power and exercise it. And it just takes one, right?
it's
When they
true.
realize what they can do.
It's true.
So they're on notice. They're on notice.
And we will be watching.
We will definitely be watching. So kudos to University of Penn for taking action. We may not like the end result because she will be back probably teaching again. But hopefully she's on notice.
Mm.
for what she can and cannot do, and students understand that they can raise up and raise a complaint, and something will happen eventually, because this
Let's
took
hope.
years. Well, it was great to also have your perspective today as, a former law school student, you
I
know.
know. I was like, oh, let me just open up these boxes that I've compartmentalized in my brain and bring it back. I'm glad it came back.
And I just want to reiterate, like you said, it's a very special person that can go to law school. And
Oh,
so,
you're too kind. You're too kind.
all right, Brittany, we'll wait for the next shenanigan and we'll talk again.
Yes, see you
All right.
soon.
Okay, wait. Ooh, why is it taking so long to stop?